Hello everybody. I know it's a bit different setup than how it usually is, but I've been trying new things. And so I think I have a better time sitting here talking to you all very casually. As this is where I sit in my room when I'm doing work. Before we get started today, please remember that I am helping Akrim Nabil raise money to get his family out of Gaza, and so I'll be linking both my TikTok, which has videos and information about his family, as well as the GoFundMe for his family in the link below. So those of you who have been paying attention, I am entering my senior year of college, and I am working on a thesis, and so I've been doing a lot of background reading regarding it. My thesis is going to be looking at the emerging national identities among American Jews post October 7th, and what narratives, factors go into that, specifically ideas of diaspora, American racial politics, relation to the Holocaust, as well as an understanding of Israel. What I've been doing so far is reading through articles pertaining to very similar topics, by that of like diaspora identity with Israeli politics. The issue is that what I'm doing is very specific to the here and now, and most of the articles I'm looking at stop at like 2016 at the latest. But I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've been reading about and some of my questions and insights regarding them, because I think that this is information that is very pertinent. I think these are conversations that are necessary, especially as I don't think this conflict of politics and identity is going away anytime soon, especially as we get into an election year. So most recently I read and analyzed the article by Theodore Sasson, Mass Mobilization to Direct Engagement, and basically he's looking at the way that American Jews as a diaspora / transnational group interact with Israel, and how that has changed from the late 1950s to, I would say most of his actual data, his survey data, goes to the 90s. But he does also pull some information from the early 2000s, but I would say from the 1960s roughly to the 1990s. And it's very fascinating, a lot of what he talks about, because it raises a bunch of questions to me about what counts as a diaspora identity, and as well as, and I think this is something that's very relevant to my research and to today, is who gets a say in national politics, especially when we interact with diaspora. So his argument is essentially that we have seen a shift in how American Jews interact with Israeli politics, with the late 50s, 60s to 70s. There are more like giant public groups that lobby on behalf of Israel, that donate money to Israel, and this is all to the Israeli government in general. And so the main group that he looks at that's still around today is AIPAC, which, if you know anything about the conflict or about American lobbying, AIPAC is still, I think, the biggest lobbyer. AIPAC and CUFI are the two biggest lobbyers for Israel in the American government. And he said that this is a pretty standard, Sasson says this is a pretty standard relationship between a diaspora community and he calls it the homeland. I have reservations about that, and I'll talk about it later. But basically between the homeland and the host country and the people living there is that they will either lobby their host country on behalf of the homeland country to support it politically or financially, or they will interact with the homeland to make it more similar to the host country. And so he says that in the 60s, 70s, we see a lot more of this lobbying on behalf of the homeland, collectively as a group, which is what he calls the mass mobilization era. And basically any kind of donations were done through these agencies that went through the government. So money was distributed to the Israeli government, and then it was up to them to do what they would with it. Similarly, these large organizations or denominational organizations were how people were mainly receiving information about Israel, and he knows a lot of people at that time had a very idealistic and symbolic idea of what Israel was. I mean, it was still pretty new at the time, especially people growing up at that period. And all they knew was that this was supposed to be their safe place, away from the Holocaust, or something like that would happen again. And this is something that we still talk about today. If you look at a lot of people online, with all of the fear-mongering about the rise of anti-Semitism in the West, you hear people saying that we need to have Israel in case like a genocide happens again, and so they need to have that like escape or exit route or like safety place to go, and that's what Israel is. So even though people are not, I would say, engaging with it directly or like going there or moving there, or gaining citizenship there, they still view it as a necessary part of Jewish life because of the anti-Semitism in history and the anti-Semitism that exists today. However, in the 80s and 90s, and I would assume up into today, with the advent of social media, but once again, Sasson doesn't cover this because this article was published in 2010, says that there is now a more direct engagement approach as we see more fractal groups forming along political lines, and he says he attributes this to, one, mass media now exists. People can now interact with Israel more directly because Israel news was now being published. The internet is now a thing and people can engage with this directly, but also that what was happening with Israeli politics in the 80s and 90s led to more people not wanting to support the government directly, but rather supporting different initiatives that they supported and not supporting others. And so this led to what he saw as like fractal organizations donating specifically to certain politicians, to certain causes, lobbying on behalf of certain causes or not certain causes, rather than just like AIPAC generally like lobbying to support Israel. And he did note that AIPAC has a general attitude of like, we will support Israel no matter what, which I think he says a lot of people didn't like, and I can understand that, especially says with the 80s, 90s, and from then, Israel has taken a very like far-right turn politically, and so I think American Jews who generally have a more leftist view of politics, at least in American politics, might not support that. And I know the biggest issue at the time that he's talking about is the issue of the West Bank settlements, and this is because Hamas as a group didn't really exist or operate in this period that he's researching. They were founded in 1987 and didn't start making big headlines or moves until the early to mid 1990s. And even then didn't get huge global and I would say main attention until the second Intifada in 2006. And so this is just something that he's not including because it's not on people's minds at the time, which I think is really fascinating, because now when we think of the big divider of American Jews' understanding of Israel and support of Israel, it is everything that has to do with Hamas and Palestine. And not to say that Palestine is still not a huge question. Obviously, the Palestinian question, as it is phrased, is always on everybody's minds. But it's not about Hamas, it is about the West Bank settlements. And this is something that is still happening today, but it's something that's taken a kind of backseat to October 7th. And so I just think it's interesting how this has shifted. And I'd love to know Sasson's thoughts on it, but once again, this is an article that was published 10 years ago. 14 years ago, crazy. But from this more direct engagement, it raised a question of who gets to be involved in Israel's politics, because Israel operates in a very interesting capacity with the diaspora, because it lauds itself and presents itself as the Jewish homeland. It is the only Jewish state. It is there for the Jewish people. However, it is also its own independent state that has non-Jewish citizens as well. I mean, if you look online, whenever people call it an apartheid state, they will always, supporters of Israel will always point out how there are an X amount of Israeli Arabs. There are a lot of Arabs in Israel. It's not all Jews, it's not all for Jews. The law is not made off of the Torah or the Tanakh. It is its own independent country that operates as an independent democracy and has been for 76 years. And there became a conflict in the 90s, 80s, 90s, because all of these fractal groups were now lobbying not only the American government, but also the Israeli government. And they were no longer giving their money to the Israeli government directly through groups like AIPAC, but rather they were going to these fractal groups to give money specifically to specific parties, to specific politicians. They were raising funds either for the West Bank settlements or against them. They were having mass movements either for or against, and basically the political tensions within Israel were now being played out in the United States through these diaspora communities. And as Sasson put it, they started to act more like Israeli citizens, even though most of them are not Israeli citizens. And this created a tension because it created the question of who gets to be an Israeli citizen, who gets to have influence on Israeli politics, because American Jews are interacting now as if they are citizens of Israel, at least the way he describes it. And apparently the Israeli government was not happy with this, and they put a thing out being like, the only people who get to decide what happens in Israel are Israeli citizens. And the ADL launched back being like, well, if you're a Jewish state, shouldn't all Jews get to decide about the state representing them? And I really like this argument. Not because I agree one way or another. I think both arguments have merit. It's just that it points out to the inconsistency in which Israel operates and places itself, because it does run all over this scale. It does, when it needs to, say that it is the Jewish state for the Jewish people. I mean, that's the argument that we see a lot now, being like, we can't have a one-state solution. We can't support from the river to the sea because it calls for a Jewish genocide, because we need to be here because this is a Jewish homeland. It is the ancient land of the Jews. It is just a Jewish homeland. You know, this is an argument that is used, that I have seen so many people use, that if Israel falls, that is a symbolic death of the Jewish people because it is the only Jewish state. But when people talk about how it's problematic that it is an only Jewish state, they'll point out how there's more than Jews live there, Arabs live there, other people live there. And so that gets to the question of, one, what does being a Jewish state really mean? Because if it's not only Jews, you're not basing the law off of Jewish law, which has been also a big point of tension with a lot of these fractal groups. Is actually a lot of right-wing, conservative, ultra-Orthodox groups don't support Israel in America because it's not the same nation as the biblical land of Israel. It's not following God's law. And so what does being a Jewish state really mean? And can you be both an independent state that is pluralist and open to all, as well as something's representative of the Jewish people? And how can you be representative of the Jewish people if not all Jewish people get a say in the nation that is supposedly representing them? And I think this is a good question to discuss when we talk about these kinds of arguments that are being made to justify the actions of the Israeli government, especially now in dealing with Hamas and in interacting with Palestine as well as the rest of the Middle East. Now, I will say I do have an issue with the constant reference to American Jews as a diaspora, especially when it comes to relation and conversation with the modern state of Israel. My biggest issue with Theodore Sasson's article is that he puts the modern state of Israel as the homeland and then the United States as the host land. And I understand that Jews are in a diaspora because we were expelled from the land of Israel 3,000 years ago. And I understand that, and that is where we get the word diaspora from. Anybody who has been forcibly expelled from their homeland and exist outside of their homeland. However, I perceive a difference between the ancient land of Israel and the modern state of Israel, because they are different. They aren't the same lineage of rulers. It's not even the same culture. I think there's a common argument that we've maintained this culture for 3,000 years, and therefore it's a decolonizing effort for the land of Israel, the state of Israel, to exist the way that it exists now. But like, we have evolved. Judaism has evolved in a bunch of different ways, and it's not the same people who have been on that land consistently who are in power now. But the Zionist movement was started by people who were in diaspora and then came back, you know, and have syncretized their culture to the lands in which their families were expelled to. And so I think it's disingenuous to name the modern state of Israel as a homeland and then everywhere else as a hostland to lineages of people who have lived longer than the modern states. It's complicated. It's really complicated, because there's nothing after that, because it's complicated and it's confusing, and it creates a power difference that I'm uncomfortable with. Because what happens when you have a homeland is you kind of have a legitimating body, especially when religion and culture and ethnicity is involved and tied to that specific land. And I think we've seen this a lot with Israel and their decision for like right of return and who gets to have the right of return, is that in doing so, they basically get to decide who is Jewish and who is not Jewish. And the issue I have with that is that because there is that discontinuity between the ancient land of Israel and the modern state of Israel, and the fact that the modern state of Israel was founded by diaspora Jews, just like myself, is that it's basically people in the same position that I was in now getting to decide if I'm Jewish or not. And they, to me, don't get to have the authority to do that. And they don't get to decide who in the diaspora gets to truly be Jewish and who gets to come back to the Holy Land when they themselves are also diaspora Jews or were also diaspora Jews. You know, like, they didn't return to the homeland because the homeland kind of ceased to exist. I mean, there are Jews who did exist there continuously, but those are not the Jews that are in charge. They're not the ones who have the authority. They're not the ones who recreated and fought for their land back. Because I'm not going to erase that Arab colonization happened. I'm not going to erase that the land has not been colonized since the land of Israel. You know, like when Jews were expelled from the land, not all the Jews were expelled, but a vast majority of us were. But it's not the people who stayed consistently and probably have the most well-connected practices, you know, that are there. It's not the people who consistently kept the line and kept the land and kept whatever that are doing this. It's people who evolved in similar ways that my family and dozens of others and thousands of other families have evolved, who are now basically being told that because they are on a certain part of land that they are more legitimate Jews than us and get to have more of a say and more authority over that than us and speak and represent us more than anybody else. And I don't like that. I'm very uncomfortable with that they're now given this homeland authority and the rest of us are labeled as transnational and in diaspora and get to be essentially shit upon by Israeli Jews, because that's a whole different power dynamic as well. Because of our existence in the diaspora, I mean, it's not like we've gotten along the best up until this point. This is really unified, I think, Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. But until then, there was a huge difference in understanding of like your place, and a lot of it is biblical in nature, because they get to exist in the ancestral homeland and others don't. And that in itself is a privilege. But also, it's just, I don't think because we have existed for so long that we need that legitimating body to legitimate ourselves as Jews. And the fact that this now exists and we can more easily exclude others that we don't like or don't agree with, it becomes a very political identity. I mean, it always has been. All identities are inherently political, but it becomes even more political who gets to be Jewish and who doesn't within the Jewish community. And that's something that I don't like. And that's why I take issue with now being told that I am in diaspora by a country that is younger than my grandmother. Like, that in itself bothers me. So yeah, I don't actually know where I was going with that rant, but that is a main critique I had of the article and of most scholarly discussions of this phenomenon. I'd say another issue that I had with Sasson is one, he cites his own work, which is already disproven and told to be really shoddy. He and this other guy, Waxman, basically had a whole back and forth, kind of like rap battle, but for researchers, like very publicly, and were basically both were like denounced by the entire scholarly community for Judaic studies because the research was done so poorly that you're like, okay, this is basically just serving to fearmonger either political side because you can't actually prove with sufficient sound data what you're saying. So the fact that he cites those articles after being publicly disproven bothers me because it just points to ego. And another thing that I don't like is that he treats this direct engagement and this breaking up and like dividing of the Jewish community and the diaspora community along political lines as like this brand new phenomenon that we're seeing, when it's not. Like, diaspora communities or any transnational communities don't exist in a monolith, similar to how host countries or homeland countries don't exist in a monolith. I think we saw this with the Spanish Civil War, where if you read Anais Nin's journal, like, she and her family were divided on which side of the Civil War they were on, and this is something that deeply affected a lot of Spanish expatriates or the Spanish diaspora in Europe, is that they had to decide who they were fighting for, and that did divide families and it did divide community. And so this division along politics of the homeland playing out in the host land, I think, is something that we have seen before. It's just not something that we can see as easily until now because we have the internet and because we have these like news articles and he's right, things are more accessible. We can learn more about what's happening in those homeland countries, but it's not like this wasn't happening previously. And I think it's very short-sighted of him to treat this as a new phenomenon when in reality this is just a more distinct and viewable and studyable example of something that has probably already existed. Sorry for the very informal, rambly video. I didn't really know what else to make a video on, and this is something that I'm really passionate about, and I want to begin sharing more of what I'm learning with you guys. So you all have the same knowledge that I do, and you are better informed when these conversations come up. I think because I also want to bring more nuance into these conversations because they are very nuanced. And I know that we are becoming more radicalized in politics for, I think, good reason, because we're past the point of trying to get listened to by the masses. And radicalization is kind of the only way to get your point across at this point, but I don't think we should ever be so radical that we shut down conversation and where we can educate people or where we can learn from others. And so with that being said, have an amazing summer, be excellent to each other, and party on, dudes. So long, and thanks for all the fish.